Hey, welcome to Panama Baptist Church. I'm Pastor Andy. I serve on staff here. So glad that you're able to join us this morning. I've got just a few announcements as we get rolling. Number one, Pastor Joel and our small group leaders are preparing now for the fall launch of adult small groups. We are looking for facilitators, we're looking for core group members, and we're looking for hosts. You can see the website for information and for the sign up form there, or you can contact Pastor Joel and he'll give you everything that you need to know about that. Super excited about this next announcement. We are going to have a BYOP and communion on August 30th. That's right, BYOP and communion. So what is that? Well, that's a church social event plus a communion service. As I already mentioned, it's August 30th. You can arrive anytime after 4. The communion service part, followed by the picnic, will be right starting at 5 o'clock. And we'll be doing that promptly at 5 o'clock. The picnic will be right afterwards. It'll be at Cornish Campground there in Bear Lake. If you need directions, contact us. We'll be glad to set you up with that. And BYOP, that stands for Bring Your Own Picnic. And so make sure you do that. We wanted to make this event as user-friendly for people. We wanted to make it so that people could feel safe to come and be able to interact. And so that meant not sharing food. So bring your own picnic. Also, bring your own lawn chair. That'll be great, unless you want to sit on the ground. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because we really miss being together. And we're also doing this because, you know what, communion reminds us that we long for the day when we'll be with Jesus. And so it's just a really great time. We're really looking forward to that. August 30th, starting at 4 o'clock. This next announcement is for members. We're going to have a business meeting September 6th. That'll be at 10:15, half an hour before the in-person gathering. On the agenda for that day are some budget items, a missions item, and some membership items. You'll be able to see more information on exactly what it is we'll be discussing and voting on there on the website. So members, we'll see you then. We'll follow our traditional or our normal social distancing and mask usage rules for that right before the service on that day. I want to talk to you guys who are part of our online audience. We're so glad that you're here and glad that you're able to do this, and we're able to do it with you week in, week out. You know, we're still kind of learning this thing as a church, you know, just in case you didn't know that. We've had an online presence for quite a while, but things have changed a lot with COVID, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what works and what doesn't work. So I want to give you a few online service tips. So here they are. Number one, you can watch anonymously. If you're just checking us out, we're so glad that you're doing it, glad you're here. You can watch anonymously. If you're watching this at the 9 o'clock service, the simulated live one, know that we love interacting. So you can still do it anonymously, but we love to interact as well. That's why we have the chat feature, and we encourage you to do that. We love knowing who's there. Second thing that's kind of different about the online service is it is okay to interact with the message content while the message is being preached. You know, if you're like me and you grew up in church, you got taught you had to be quiet at church, and you definitely didn't talk during the sermon. That's the big advantage of doing it online. You can send notes and interact and share what it was that especially is meaningful to you right while the sermon is being preached. That is okay at the online service. And lastly, we love engagement. And so if you are going to watch this with us at the 9 o'clock online service, at the end, before you go, we want to really encourage you to do something for us before you leave. Would you consider posting something that's really eye-opening, posting something maybe that was encouraging or challenging, or something you plan to try throughout the week as a result of the message or the music, or something that you want to be sure to share with someone else? If you would do that before you leave, that would be really great, because number one, it helps cement that in your own mind, what it is you want to carry with you in the coming week and what you got out of the service. Number two, it helps us to be, as individuals, to not be just consumers of this content, but active participants in it. And third, it's just wildly encouraging to other people. It's one of the ways that we can minister to each other. So I really want to encourage you to do that. I'll post this little reminder again at the end of the 9 o'clock service there for you, so you don't have to remember. Let's jump in and sing along with the praise band as we worship our God.
Do you feel the world is broken? We do. Do you feel the shadows deepen? We do. But do you know that all the dark won't stop the light from getting through? We do. Do you wish that you could see it all made new? We do. Is all creation groaning? It is. Is a new creation coming? It is the glory of the Lord to be the light within our midst. It is. Is it good that we remind ourselves of this? It is. Sing out. Is anyone worthy? Is anyone whole? Is anyone able to break the seal and open the scroll? The Lion of Judah, who conquered a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I cast my mind to Calvary, where Jesus bled and died for me. I see his wounds, his hands, his feet, my Savior on that cursed tree. His body bound and drenched in tears, they laid him down in Joseph's tomb, the entrance sealed by heavy stone. Messiah still and all alone. Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise his name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise. Oh Lord our God. Then on the third, at break of dawn, the Son of Heaven rose again. Oh, tremble death, where is your sting? The angels roar for Christ the King. Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise his name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise. Oh Lord our God. He shall return in robes of white. The blazing sun shall pierce the night, and I will rise among the saints. My gaze turns fixed on Jesus' face. Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise his name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise. Oh Lord our God. Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise his name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise. Oh Lord our God. Oh Lord our God.
My name is Joel, and I serve as one of the pastors here at Panama Baptist Church, and we are in week 2 in our look at forgiveness. Now, this is falling under the bigger umbrella of the study that we are doing that we've called the One Another's. First, we did encourage one another, and pray for one another. Now we're looking at forgiveness. We left off with the question last week of what are the action steps to forgive. We've tried to leave each week with some action steps, some things that you can do to put these one another's into practice. But forgiveness is such a difficult topic. It is far easier to talk about it than it is to put it into practice. And so we expanded this out into 2 weeks because when we talk about forgiveness, often we are talking about times when we have been hurt in immeasurable and unimaginable ways. And it's tough. It is hard. To recap last week, if you missed it, we talked about that when we forgive one another, we're acknowledging that wrong has been done to us. And that we need to recognize that forgiveness is a very difficult thing to do. And why is it so difficult? And I gave you 3 reasons last week. First, we talked about that forgiveness costs us something. There is a price to forgiveness. Second, it goes against our sin nature. We want to make other people suffer. We want to make them pay sometimes, if we're being honest with ourselves. And third, we looked at Matthew chapter 18, and we talked about that it just goes against our common sense. It doesn't seem reasonable. It doesn't seem fair. It makes us feel gullible or naive. And we talked about how forgiveness is a little bit like ketchup toast. And if you're not sure what I mean, if you didn't catch it last week, you're going to want to go back and watch that. Safe to say I have learned more about your toast preferences and what you like to eat on your toast. I've learned about that more in the last week than I have in probably the last 8 months combined. So there are many reasons why forgiveness is difficult. We only talked about 3. I got some feedback from others of you about why forgiveness is difficult for you, and I appreciate hearing from you and getting your feedback on that. And the challenge when we're talking about forgiveness is that this is easier said than done. Well, what about when this person did that to me? Or what about this situation that I was in? So understanding all of that kind of is the baseline with what we talked about last week. Let's start by looking at the same verses that we looked at last week. Would you read these with me? Let's start in Colossians chapter 3, verse 12 and 13. Therefore, as God's chosen ones, holy and dearly loved, put on compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another and forgiving one another, if anyone has a grievance against another, just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you are also to forgive. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 31 and 32. Let all bitterness, anger, and wrath, shouting and slander be removed from you, along with all malice, and be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving one another, just as God also forgave you in Christ. Did you notice anything similar about those 2 verses, Colossians 3, verse 13, and Ephesians 4:32? There is a repeated idea that is crucial to our understanding of forgiveness. If we put the 2 verses side by side, look at them together. Do you see it? Do you see the repeated idea? We are to forgive others just as God has forgiven us. Those 2 words, if you're taking notes, if you printed out the outline from the website or you're just taking notes on a piece of paper, those 2 words, just as, put it in bold, capitalize it, underline it, whatever you have to do, those 2 words are really the critical point. They are the crucial understanding we have to have when it comes to this idea of forgiveness. I am to forgive just as I have been forgiven. And so that begs the question as we get started this morning, how have I been forgiven? How did God forgive me? What does that look like? What does that mean? And so for our time together this morning, I want to go back to Matthew chapter 18. This is the same passage we looked at last week. You'll remember that Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he starts by talking about the 99 sheep and the one that has gone astray, and they're able to bring that sheep back and restore the sheep back to the flock. And then he talks about the idea of what happens when a brother is sinning against you. How do you go? And with the goal being to restore and to forgive. And we ended then with Peter coming to Jesus and asking the question, how many times should I forgive? 7? And Jesus responds, not 7, but 70 times 7. And we talked about how that goes against common sense. That doesn't seem fair. That makes us feel gullible or weak. But the conversation doesn't stop there after that question. Jesus, then, as he's talking to his disciples, uses another illustration, a parable or a story if you will, to demonstrate how we are to forgive. And more than that, it answers the question of how did God forgive us? How have I been forgiven? So let's go back and look at Matthew chapter 18. We're going to pick it up in verse 21. Then Peter approached him and asked, Lord, how many times must I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? As many as 7 times? I tell you, not as many as 7, Jesus replied, but 70 times 7. Now, verse 23, and this is when Jesus begins to tell his story that we want to look at this morning. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle accounts, one who owed 10,000 talents was brought before him. Since he did not have the money to pay it back, his master commanded that he, his wife, his children, and everything he had be sold to pay the debt. So let's dissect this as we're going along. Verse 23 lets us know that the king in this story is God, right? This is like the kingdom of heaven. And so Jesus is saying the king, that is God in this story, wants to settle accounts. It was time to make things right. It was time to pay their debts, to call in the loan, so to speak. And this one particular servant owed 10,000 talents. Now, what does that mean, 10,000 talents? Is that like being able to sing or dance or play an instrument? No, it's not that kind of a talent. What would that number and word have meant to somebody that was listening in this particular time? Now, I like math. Math was one of my favorite subjects in school. I like a good spreadsheet. And so let's do a little bit of math when it comes to 10,000 talents. A talent was the largest unit of currency at that time. It would be like if we said a $100 bill. Right, there isn't anything larger than a $100 bill, although dating back, I think it was to 1945, in the research that I did, the Federal Reserve was issuing larger bills, and the largest bill they ever issued was a $10,000 bill, but they stopped printing in 1945, taken out of circulation about 20 years later because nobody was really using it, neither here nor there. Just a little interesting fact in case you wind up on Jeopardy or something like that. So the talent was the largest unit of currency at that time. And it was equivalent, a talent was equivalent to 6,000 days of wages. Or if you worked 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, it would take you 16 and a half years to earn one talent. And that's just one talent. Now, let's do our math. The average American worker today, according to the research that I did, makes $19.33 an hour. Now, if you're paying back a debt, let's say you're working 12 hours a day, so 84 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, because you don't have time to take vacation when you're paying down this huge debt. So one talent at $19.33 an hour, 84 hours a week, 52 weeks out of the year would be $1,393,151.76. That's just one talent. The story says that this servant owed 10,000 talents. Now, here's what you need to know about the number 10,000. It was the largest number that could be written in that language, in the Greek. They literally wrote the highest number that the language knew. There was no larger number at that time in their language. It's practically the equivalent of us saying infinity. But let's just go with the number 10,000 for right now. That's $13,931,517,600. That was the debt that this servant owed. But remember, at $19.33 an hour, you're only making $231.96 a day. So if you worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, it would take you to pay back 10,000 talents, 164,548 years. That is how long it would take you to pay it back. In other words, this debt that this servant owed was impossible to repay. It's like when you go car shopping. I don't know if you've heard my van driving around, but you always know when we're coming. It's got a power steering pump that sounds like it needs to be replaced, but it's still working fine. And there's some other things with the muffler and things, but it's got a lot of miles on it, but we don't owe anything on it. So like we're just content just to drive it into the ground. But I like to watch what's out there with car deals and, look at the loans and crunch some numbers. I told you I like math, kind of figure out what's out there. And, you kind of say, okay, do I want like a 4-year loan on this car? Do I want a 5-year loan? And now it seems like more often than not, they make it really, really easy to get a 6-year loan. And oh, look how low your payment can be if you want to pay this back for the next 6 years. And I think about that. I'm like, do I really want to get a car loan for 6 years? Like Zachary, my son, is 12 and a half. He'd be 18 and a half by the time I got that paid off. He'd be getting ready to go to college, which scares me for all sorts of other reasons, let alone trying to pay a car back up until that time. But this is a debt that would take 164,548 years to repay. This debt could not be repaid. Let's keep reading Matthew chapter 18, verse 26. At this, the servant fell face down before him and said, "Be patient with me, and I will pay you everything." Then the master of that servant, that is God in this story, had compassion, released him, and forgave him the loan. Now, the servant still doesn't get it, right? The servant thinks that the debt can be repaid. He doesn't want his family to be sold, so he pleads and he begs for mercy and for the chance to repay it. And oftentimes we do the same thing with God. We think that we can repay the debt that we owe God. And over the course of my life, my good will outweigh the bad, and I can repay God in that way, or I can just make things right, and I can settle my own accounts. I can take care of this myself. But God knows that we can never repay the debt. It is far too steep of a price to be able to pay, just as the master in this story knew that the servant would never be able to repay. And so in verse 27, the master has compassion and grace and mercy and forgives him the debt. The master cancels the debt in the same way that God has canceled our debt. Verse 28, that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. He grabbed him, started choking him, and said, "Pay what you owe." At this, his fellow servant fell down and began begging him, "Be patient with me, and I will pay you back." But he wasn't willing. Instead, he went and threw him into prison until he could pay what was owed. So let's do the math again here. A denarii was about a day's wage. 100 denarii was about 3.5 months worth of wages. So to compare these two debts, the servant owed and was forgiven a debt that would have taken 164,548 years to repay. Meanwhile, he was owed a debt that would have just taken 100 days to repay. And similar to how that first servant had reacted, the second servant, who is now in debt, begs for patience and promises that he will pay him back. But the first servant did not have mercy. He did not have patience and grace, and he threw him into prison until it could be repaid. But here's the question: how long would it take to pay back 100 days of wages if you're in prison and you can't work? I mean, this was a manageable debt. This could be repaid. But the first servant had no compassion, had no grace. And so as we keep reading in verse 31, when the other servants saw what had taken place, they were deeply distressed and went and reported to their master everything that had happened. Then, after he had summoned him, his master said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Shouldn't you also have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you?" And because he was angry, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay everything that was owed. So also my heavenly Father will do to you unless every one of you forgives his brother or sister from your heart. Those last two verses, verses 34 and 35, what does that mean exactly? When it says that my heavenly Father will do to you unless every one of you forgives his brother or sister from your heart, what exactly is Jesus saying there? And I've got to be honest, I'm not entirely sure. There's other passages that kind of speak to this as well. And in the different commentaries that I tried to read and the Bible scholars that know far more than I do, not a lot of them really addressed verse 35. But here's the one thing that I think I do know about what those last two verses are saying, is that God will not treat an unforgiving spirit lightly. When we have been forgiven, if you are a Christ follower, Scripture is clear that we are to forgive. And when we don't, God does not take that lightly. So how do we do that? How do we forgive? That's how we teased the end of last week, and now it's time to talk about it. And here's the thing about forgiveness that I want us to take from this story that will help us in these last minutes that we have together, is that when we talk about forgiveness, there is a debt that is owed to us. Right? This ties into something we said last week, that when we talk about forgiveness, we're acknowledging that wrong has been done to us. When someone wrongs me, they now owe me something because they've taken something from me. Here's what I mean by that. If someone goes and they've gossiped about you, or they've spread lies about you, they have taken from you, maybe in part, a good reputation that you had. If someone is rude or aggressive towards me, maybe they've taken my sense of safety and security, or maybe they've actually stolen from me, and so they've taken my possessions or taken my money. Maybe I interact with somebody that's just inconsiderate or selfish, and so they take my sense of belonging and self-worth. People that have wronged us have a debt to repay. And so what happens when we've had something taken from us? We get angry. Right? I need to be repaid for that. You need to make things right. And we get bitter if we don't deal with it, and we have ill feelings towards this person. It's like the iced tea that we talked about last week, that if we let this forgiveness or this unforgiveness just sit there and kind of fester and we don't deal with it, not only will God deal with us in an undesirable way, but the bitterness and the anger, it changes who we are, and it changes our hearts and what comes out of us. And what's the solution to that anger and that forgiveness? It's being able to forgive. Let's go back and look at Ephesians chapter 4. These two verses, 31, 32, are tied together, I think, for a reason. Let all bitterness, anger, and wrath, shouting and slander be removed from you, along with all malice. What's the solution? How do we get rid of the anger? Because the anger sometimes is a result of that feeling that something has been or is being taken away from us. And what does Paul tell us in verse 32? We get rid of that by being kind and compassionate, forgiving one another. That's how we deal with the anger and the bitterness. And notice that Paul doesn't leave any outs here in these verses. There are no special exceptions. There's no clauses for extreme cases. There's no loopholes. We are commanded to forgive just as we have been forgiven, like that servant in the story. And the thought might be going through your mind, well, but Paul, the author of this book, he doesn't know what I've been through. He doesn't know what's been done to me and the ways that I've been hurt. And you're absolutely right. Paul doesn't know. I don't know all the things that you've been through. But even just take Paul's situation when he wrote these words. He's in prison as he's writing this. He's been arrested unjustly, and he's been waiting for at least a year for his trial to take place. And yet he's writing these words of put away your anger, put away your bitterness, and forgive just as we've been forgiven. Because while Paul didn't know what you've been through, he does know that we've been forgiven. And so in order to understand and practice true forgiveness, we have to have a right understanding of who we are. And who we are a people that we have a debt that cannot be repaid. And we have to have a true understanding of who God is. That is one that has canceled our debt. And that's really the key to this whole idea of forgiveness. And this kind of forgiveness that we're talking about, if you're watching this and you have not experienced God's forgiveness, this isn't making any sense to you. We have to look at this through the perspective of a forgiven person. And when we do that, that type of perspective changes everything. It's like this little picture I found. I'll give you a chance to take that in. You've got two people there arguing about perspective. One saying there's 4 boards, and the other one is saying there are 3. Well, which is it? Is it 4 or is it 3? Well, it depends on your perspective. It depends on which angle you're looking at. And if you haven't experienced the forgiveness of God, this idea that we are to forgive just as we've been forgiven isn't going to make sense. You're looking at it from the wrong perspective. But those of us that have the that should have the right perspective, that have been forgiven, have to keep this in mind. Andy Stanley wrote a book called Enemies of the Heart, and in this book, he says that when we are hesitant to forgive, it's often because we are evaluating the decision in light of what has been done to us, not what has been done for us. That's a very important distinction to make. And as followers of Christ who have been redeemed through the gospel of Jesus Christ, we have the ability to view forgiveness from the perspective of the cross and the work that has been done there. And one of the first things we have to know when we come to the action steps of forgiveness is that forgiveness is a choice. It is not a feeling. Forgiveness is a choice. It is not a feeling. Have you ever felt like forgiving? If we waited until we felt like it, we would be waiting for a very, very long time. Paul does not use it that in the sense that it is a feeling. Rather, Paul is saying forgiveness is an active state of mind, a choice that we must make on a regular, daily basis. And so know that when we talk about forgiving, just as we have been forgiven, we are talking about a conscious choice that we are making. And so finally, that brings us to the action steps. It's time to talk about them. There are 4 steps, probably processes would be a better word, and these 4 processes come from that book I referenced a moment ago, Enemies of the Heart by Andy Stanley. When we've been hurt deeply, or just through the daily offenses, how do we forgive? So here are 4 action processes. Here's number 1. Identify who you are angry with. Identify who you're angry with. Forgiveness is not just forgive and forget. It's not just moving on with your life and forgetting about the past. We are canceling a debt. That is what forgiveness is. We're not just trying to forget it. Now, in the moment, if this is a daily occurrence, the answer is going to be pretty obvious, right? My wife said this to me, or my husband didn't do this. My coworker said this about me, or my friend didn't follow through on this. And so the answer might be fairly obvious, but maybe you're wanting to deal with some deeper, unresolved anger and bitterness in your life. And in the book, the author recommends making a list of people who have mistreated you or who have taken advantage of you. And maybe you do that by answering questions like, who do you hope to never see again? Who do you find yourself having imaginary conversations with? Who do you wish you could pay back if you knew you could get away with it? Who do you hope fails? So make a list. Identify who it is that you're angry with. The second process is to determine what they owe you. I know that sounds a little bit weird. It's not something that we often do. And so as a result, we kind of forgive generally, but we don't forgive specifically. And this is where that story of the unforgiving servant, this is where that's helpful. We know exactly the debt that was forgiven, the debt that was canceled. And so we know who it is that we're angry with, and we kind of know what they did, but what exactly did they take? What is the debt that they owe? And we have to be able to answer this question in order to forgive, because general forgiveness doesn't heal specific hurts. And it's important to pinpoint what was taken from you. What do the people on your list owe you? What did they take from you? What would they need to return in order to put things back the way that they were? Is it just an apology? Is it money? Time? Family? Relationships? Reputation? A job? Think about it specifically. This is a debt that this person owes you. And you can't cancel the debt that hasn't been clearly identified. So identify who you're angry with. Identify the debt that they owe you. And then action process number 3, cancel the debt. You've identified who you're angry with. You know who needs forgiveness. You know what the debt is. And now you have to make the decision, not wait for the feeling. That's why we started by saying forgiveness is a choice, it is not a feeling, but you have to make the decision that the offending party doesn't owe you anything anymore. Christ has canceled our debt at Calvary, a debt that could never be repaid. and Christ canceled it. God demanded payment for the debt, but Jesus Christ offered himself as the payment for our sins, and Christ canceled the debt on our behalf, and now we do the same thing to others. Now, this decision might be something as simple as a decision you make quietly in your heart, or you might decide to do something more tangible, especially if you're dealing with things from the past. The book recommends maybe you make a list, and then you burn the list as just a signifying way that you are canceling the debt. Before Bethany Camp, I worked at another camp, and there they would do this ceremony where you would write some things down and then literally nail them to a cross that they had made, just signifying that Christ had paid the debt for those sins as well. And for the daily offenses that we do occur, you might not always write it down, but you might do something simple and quick and specific. Here's a sample prayer that you might make. Heavenly Father, this person has taken this from me. I have held on to this debt long enough. I choose to cancel this debt. This person doesn't owe me anymore. Just as you forgave me, I forgive this person. So we choose to cancel the debt. And then the last process, and maybe the most difficult, is to dismiss the case. This step is a daily decision that you're not going to reopen this case anymore. But what makes this so difficult is that our feelings don't automatically follow our decision to forgive. Sometimes feelings are the last thing to come around. Forgiving doesn't erase our memories. I mean, if we truly could forgive and forget, this would be a whole lot easier. But then there's something that happens that triggers the memories for you all over again, and all of the feelings come flooding back in. And one of two things happen. Neither response is very helpful, but we can take hold of that offense all over again. We start having those conversations again and those secret wishes, and we reopen the case, and the bitterness begins to creep back in. Or we just don't try to think about it and turn our thoughts elsewhere. Neither way particularly works. But when these memories come back up, and this case seems like it's asking to be reopened, we should go ahead and face these feelings and these memories head on. But instead of reopening the case against the offender, we take this opportunity to affirm and to say again, your decision, this person doesn't owe me anything. I have canceled their debt to me in the same way that I have had my debts canceled. And so we ask God to give us the grace and the strength to forgive and to follow through on these decisions day in and day out. This is a daily battle. But don't let your feelings be the gauge on whether or not you've forgiven someone. Feelings will come and feelings will go, but the decisions that we make have the ability to last. If you've been watching this online with us, and this idea of God canceling our debts is new to you, and it's not something you've heard of before, you're not sure if you've ever made that decision before, or if God has canceled your debts, or maybe you've got a debt too big to cancel and God could never forgive you. We would love to have the opportunity to talk with you. We're going to put a button on the screen if you're watching this at 9 o'clock that would just give you the opportunity to contact Pastor Andy or myself, and we would love to have the chance to answer any questions that you have or to be able to talk and pray with you. But for those of you that are watching this and you have made that decision and you know that God has paid your debts and now you need to forgive as well, let me close just by reading a paragraph from this book, Enemies of the Heart. Here's what it says. In the shadow of my hurt, forgiveness feels like a decision to reward my enemy. But in the shadow of the cross, forgiveness is merely a gift from one undeserving soul to another. Forgiveness is the gift that ensures my freedom from a prison of bitterness and resentment. When I accept forgiveness from God, I'm set free from the penalty of my sin. When I extend forgiveness to my adversary, there's a sense in which I'm set free from his sin as well. We are to forgive one another. And it's hard. Man, this is hard. But it's a daily battle. It's a daily decision that has to be made. And we are to forgive just as we have been forgiven. Praying for you in this regard. I'm praying that God will give you the grace and the mercy and the strength that you need every day as you fight this battle. I'd love to have the opportunity to connect with you, to talk with you. Don't hesitate to reach out. Have a great week. Continuing to pray for you. Thanks for joining us.